Welcome home. The two words that, as veterans and even civilians, we're so often wanting to hear. A place where we can be ourselves. And so often in this world, we don't find ourselves welcome or at home. And that's why we have this podcast. As always, I'm Andy Weins, and I'm joined by my good buddy Dylan to talk about the transformation from troops and boots to veterans in the civilian world. Today, we're going to jump right into it as to why are we doing this? You know, there's podcasts. There's 4 million plus podcasts out in the world. Dylan and I have been both successful in coaching and consulting in business and professional worlds, and we decided to jump into this podcast for several reasons. So we're going to be a little vulnerable, open up ourselves to you, the audience, to get a better idea of why this matters to us. So, Dylan, how are you doing today?
I'm pretty good. I just want to point out that he sounded a little bit like Walter Cronkite there on the intro. It was beautiful.
I didn't have a newspaper or a cigarette. Well, here's the deal. Here's what's interesting with this podcast, right? I do another podcast called the Trash Talk Business Podcast, and I yell and I swear and I goof around a lot. And I did that a few hours ago, and for this podcast, it's more sombering, but it doesn't have to be sourful, right? It's serious, yeah. Right? There's a way to talk about this serious because right before the program here, we were talking, hey, let's talk, right? And recently I shot a commercial for the 988. Which is the new national hotline for people's suicide and crisis prevention. And I shot a commercial here in Wisconsin. And when you bring up the word suicide and crisis, there's a serious, sombering tone to it. And so you have to put yourself in the right mindset. But even as I say this out loud, it's like, well, we don't have to be sourful. We don't have to be overly serious. Like, let's talk about it. It's part of life, right? Yeah. It's a condition of being human. It's a condition of being in the West. It's a Western thing, right? Suicide. A lot of humans don't struggle with this, and yet here in the West, it's something we struggle with. And in the veteran community, it's prevalent.
Massively prevalent.
Massively prevalent. And that was the basis behind this podcast. Not this idea of suicide, but this idea of being successful and thriving versus surviving. As veterans, we often operate in our lower brains, our lizard brain, and our fight, flight, or freeze brain, because that's what we've been conditioned. We're consistently looking for stimuluses that might be a threat. We anticipate a lot of things that aren't threats as threats, and so that leads us to anxiety and stress and depression and all these other human conditions at a higher level than the average person, the average American, right? Without getting very global, right? Let's say 340 million Americans, roughly. 1% are identified as veterans. So it's like, what can we say within our population of the American culture separates us from everybody else? And why is it important that we have a podcast, a place of resource for our community, and also an opportunity for us to talk about our journey with people that aren't necessarily in our community, but are interested in listening and hearing. That's why. Yeah. Anyways, I'm not going to say that's the whole podcast, but that's really why I'm doing this.
Right. There's both this. We have obviously the knowledge. Like I've been in 15 years. You've been in what, 18, right?
19 in a month.
19 in a month, right? So we've been in almost almost 35 years together, right? 34 years almost. And so we've obviously had that experience to know what it's like to be a veteran and transition into the civilian world pretty much every month as National Guard and Army Reserve. But I think there's also, for me, there's an exploratory kind of function to this, is that we get to talk to new veterans all the time. We get to have different kinds of conversations all the time about different topics. And so it's how can we explore this in a way that also helps the audience, who I would imagine is going to be mostly veteran, but probably family of veterans, friends of veterans, bosses and coworkers of veterans, and how can they benefit from our exploration into these topics? And I think it's something that it's an endeavor that we've obviously agreed to do, but it's an endeavor that has been obviously near and dear to both of our hearts for a long time, that we're both just trying to help people kind of figure things out just as we are.
Well, and that's the thing. I'll even go a little selfishly. for years, I never talked about being a vet. I got back from Iraq. I did my thing. I got a job. Right. I talked about being a vet when it was a point of emphasis when I was complaining. Right here I am, a combat vet, couldn't get a job. Right? That was about the only time I talked about being a veteran. Right, when I used it as a crutch, and then I got away from it because I got my feet below me, and then I got back from. I did another deployment to Gitmo, and when I got back from Gitmo, my father really encouraged me. He's not a veteran. He really encouraged me to lean in on my veteran status for my business. And I didn't want to use it as a crutch. I didn't want to, have this as my identifier. I wanted people to hire our company because we're really good at what we do, not because I'm a veteran. And I got over that. I got involved in a franchise organization that really leaned into being veterans. And then I became this pseudo voice or liaison for veterans. And what I realized was we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity here to share our voice. And what happened with this during this period was I started hiring veterans and being around veterans, and we started talking. And it wasn't about, when I talked to my guys I deployed with and served with, we had conversations were very, remember that time and place or that person, or right, we had this shared experience. Then when I started talking to veterans of different wars, different ages, different ethnicities, different branches, all of a sudden it's like, well, hold on. There's some things that we all went through, different periods of our time periods within our lives, but we all went through these natural things. And so from a selfish perspective, it was very therapeutic. Mm-hmm. And now this podcast is an opportunity to be very intentional, right? Life is about intentionality within the chaos of this world. I talk about it in business. I talk about it in life, right? Intentionality within the chaos. So now we take, right, 90 minutes or so out of our weeks to have a conversations together, and also conversation with other veterans. And for me, it's therapeutic. And for our audience, it's also therapeutic to listen to other people talk, because it allows you to quiet your brain down. But then you'll hear things and you'll say, wow, I felt that. I feel heard. I feel understand. And sometimes you don't have the words. You have a feeling you don't have the words. Mm-hmm. And so the goal here is that there's going to be things that you and I say, that our guests say, that are the words that veterans or family members of veterans had on the tip of their tongue and couldn't quite articulate. That's the power here.
Yep. Yeah, that's the same sentiment in a lot of my work. Is much of my work as a mental health coach is really designed around offering a place for people to express themselves and open up about the things that have deeply hurt them and impacted them, and that in its own way is the first step towards healing, in my opinion, right? Like healing mm-hmm. the internal wounds. The body heals its external wounds, but the internal is a very dynamic resurgence in many ways of emotions and feelings that we really don't talk about, right? And this, bringing it into the veteran world, when a veteran steps into the military, it's probably not the first time they've endured trauma, right? When you go to basic training, or when you go to Afghanistan or Iraq or Vietnam or the Gulf War, it doesn't matter. Like wherever you've probably been traumatized in some way, even by the military itself, right? Yeah. But that's probably, and I would say it's an incredibly high chance that that's not the first time you've endured trauma. And so when we really have these conversations, that recognition of the words that we're speaking is really an understanding that you yourself have been through something that you have never processed your way through. And I hope that people listening to this are willing to kind of look at themselves and how they feel through their experience of life and understand where these things came from. Because, when you hear more about my story, and I have no doubt when you hear more about Andy's story, is that you start to learn that you are very much the arbiter of where you go, based on how you actually allow yourself to experience life. And you very much have to approach what has happened to you. You have to learn how to express it. You have to learn how to discuss it. because that's the only way you can actually change perspective. That's the only way you can really change and understand how your body and your mind are actually quite disconnected in experiencing the world. And I hope that, we get into that throughout, obviously today, but throughout the many episodes that we're going to have beyond this, because in my experience, it's such a hard thing to explain sometimes, but it is arguably one of the most important things that I've ever worked with people on, is learning how to very much look at yourself from a third perspective and understand who you are and what has made you the way you are, and then how to heal it.
Yeah, and so what's interesting is you said have to about 3 or 4 times in the one line, right? You have to do this, you have to do that. When you're talking about self-awareness, right? Because when we become self-aware, we're able to pick up on triggers and identifiers in shorter amount of time and then regulate in real time, right? Self-regulation, right? That's the next step of the evolution. But here's what's interesting. I hate the adage have to, right? It feels like an obligation. However, right, here's where we get empowering speech, because I'm all about the words, right, as we know. And I'll say this, when you take the time like you and I are, you get to explore. You get to understand where that trauma comes from. You get to understand your triggers. As you were talking, I think about one of the things that has carried with me 38 years, and I'm wrapping my head around, and it's this idea that I'm not good enough. Mm-hmm. I felt it from my father. I felt it from the bullies in grade school. I felt it from the people I served with that were, faster, smarter, shot better, whatever. Right? I felt it in a lot of romantic relationships where what they wanted, right, in the relationship was what I wasn't willing or able or wanting to deliver. So this constant feeling of I wasn't good enough. It was only in the last few weeks I've really come through counseling and conversations. I've come to this realization, no, you are good enough. There's obviously always room for improvement, always improve your fighting position, work on yourself, absolutely. But I've always been good enough, right? The good Lord or whomever put me on this earth, right? I won the race, right? Out of whatever, 8 billion sperm, I won the race. So I was good enough, right? I passed the initial test. The adage that I'm not good enough is in my head.
Yeah.
It wasn't that I wasn't good enough for my dad. It's that he wanted to push me harder. It wasn't that I wasn't good enough for the bullies. They were jerks, and they were figuring themselves out at an adolescence. It wasn't that I wasn't good enough for the Army. It was that my strengths were different than others, and why do I need to compare? And in romantic relationships, it wasn't that I wasn't good enough for other partners. It was their expectations were me didn't serve who I was, and vice versa. My expectations were theirs. I actually heard something recently that really hit. There's a woman, she talks about relationship advice. Emily King. Mm-hmm. And I watched a lot of her content. What was really interesting, I watched one of her shorts recently, and it was like, hey, what is it you look for in a relationship? Right. And she listed the top things, right? Intelligence, good looking, good nature, excited, whatever, and all those things. Right. And she goes, what the best thing to look for is low expectations. And I was like, wow, doesn't that slap?
Yeah.
Low expectation says, hey, you show up and you be you. That's the expectation. You be you and I'll be me. And where we meet is beautiful, which is a saying I go by. And you know what? I've had to say that to myself. It's like, hold on. What if I hold myself to lower expectations when I'm feeling like I'm not good enough? And if I lower the bar and say, well, hold on, what am I good enough about? Well, I'm here, I did this, and now I'm going to start celebrating victories. And even when I was at my lowest, right? Well, I didn't kill myself. Okay, well, that's good. I quit smoking. I didn't go to the bar. Okay, you know what? Some days, that's a good day.
Yeah.
Right? And some days, that's what I was capable of. No, the bar doesn't have to stay there. It's not static. It doesn't mean that I'm going to settle for that. But some days, that's what I needed to do to get through the day. Some days, that was good enough for that day.
Right.
Now, the goal is that we get a little bit of dirt below our boots from the day before, and we're that much taller the next day, and we're that much closer to our goal. And that's all on me. And I have to come to peace with that. And that's been tough. I don't want to use the word tough. It's been complicated because it's in my subconscious and it lives there and it's really, really loud. And it's even louder when I'm right? I use the analogy or the acronym HALT, which I learned in suicide prevention class about a year ago, and it stuck with me because it works, right? Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. When you are one or multiple of those things, your clear, conscious top of the brain is not firing, while your lower lizard fight or flight or freeze brain is very active, right? Because now your subconscious is running the show. And so I have to recognize when I'm one of those four things and a stimulus shows up and I have this preconceived notion that I'm not good enough, I'm not going to get what I want out of life. And it's 100% controllable by me.
Yeah. I mean, it is and it isn't sometimes, right? And I think that's the important thing to really look at times, is that you and your subconscious, right? Well, I should say your subconscious, which is really your nervous system, and your body are firing on two different planes at some points, especially those who have been traumatized, right? So, because trauma, the energy that trauma delivers, right? Danger, right? When you go through a dangerous situation, you increase the amount of energy that you have, right? Your body naturally does that. But that energy lives within the body, right? Muscles, skeletal structure, all that stuff, right? The tissue. But your nervous system is the kind of the chain that connects that to the brain. And along the way, there's disconnection that happens when that energy isn't processed and activated all the way through, right? So this is where PTSD comes from, and trauma becomes a very negative side effect of the scenario that you went through, where from that point where you think you have control, there are times where you actually don't, because your body and again your subconscious and your nervous system are actually firing on different planes, where your body's going to do what it thinks is right, and then your mind is going to want to do what it thinks it's right. But the reality is one of those may not be right, or both of those may not be right at all, or both of those may be, completely wrong on both ends of the spectrum. Right?
In that situation, they can both be wrong. One can be wrong. They both can't be right, though. Right? Like that's the one scenario, right? If your body's going left and your brain's going right.
Yeah. Well, in some ways it can, right? The problem is
you can't do both. Great, you can't do both.
The problem is the body can't regulate itself.
Yeah.
And so where someone without, or who has healed trauma or doesn't have this trauma effect on them, that person is going to look at that situation and going to be able to, I'm going to logically regulate and emotionally regulate all at the same time and determine what's the best way to react. Whereas someone who's been traumatized and has not processed through that trauma is going to sit in that situation and just emotionally overload. And that emotional overload is going to ignite the amygdala to say, hey, we're going to shut down logic because we're in danger, right? And so your body is going to respond, right? But your mind is not going to be able to actually activate what you want it to, right? And that's where like the anger, especially in veterans, comes from, is that we've in many ways trained ourselves to become angry, and that immediately shuts down logic rather than allow us to logically and regulate it from a regulated standpoint, conduct whatever business we're trying to do. Is that we go straight into a trauma response without even thinking, because we've trained it to be that, because we've overloaded ourselves. And I think a lot of this comes from not so much trauma, but such a consistent amount of change, like drastic and dramatic change, going to Afghanistan and then coming back home. Both of those are extreme changes, and we don't have a lot of time to adapt to those. And so you end up living with this constant overload, and you step into this emotional overload consistently, and it becomes a habit, right? The body, the tissue in the body creates that habit because it was categorized as a dangerous situation. And every time you feel that same emotion or those same kind of environmental consistencies, you pull out that category of memory and say, and your body says, hey, we're in danger again. That's where you become angry. It's where you become fearful. It's where you become anxious consistently over and over. And the body's really just trying to process that, but the mind isn't allowing it to, because you get people like who've been through, let's say, Vietnam. They come home and they say, I'm never going to talk about that because I'm going to start feeling things. And that's dangerous. I've been told that's dangerous, or I feel like that's dangerous. Right. And so that's where you find these big emotions and these high amounts of energy within the body are never actually processed and expressed in whatever way they need to be expressed, because people have been told, don't talk about it, shut it down, don't feel things, right? They've been told all the wrong things for so many years that now they're living in this disconnected body that wants to feel but doesn't allow itself to feel, and logically justifies why it shouldn't talk about it, why you shouldn't express yourself, and you justify that you're a dangerous tool if you start to talk about it, and it just becomes this never-ending cycle. But what that does is eventually the system overloads, and either that ends in typically suicide, or it ends in things like autoimmune disorders, cancers, and just general breaking down of the body.
Yeah, you're saying you're holding on to these toxic, whatever, memories, images, whatever it might be. And so we know that the logic was flawed back in the day, which was, do nothing, right? Or, you're weak for talking about it. So what ends up happening when you do start expressing it? Well,
a lot of discomfort initially, right? Like it's not an easy thing to step into. And initially when I work with people, the first thing that I do, right? Like, I'm not in the business of necessarily healing your trauma initially. I'm in the business of building a relationship, because what we don't often see is especially veterans, we look at the mental health kind of aspect of things and we're like, should I go to a therapist? No, that guy won't understand me. Fuck that guy. Right. Or whoever it is. Right. Even if it's a veteran, like, I don't fucking want to talk about it with this guy. He's probably a badass and he'll probably look at me and judge me. Right. So the first thing that we're actually doing is we're looking at the relationship that we're going to have with this person and already assuming judgment and blame. Right. We're looking at that and we're already creating a lack of safety. And the reality is if you want to overcome any of this, if you want to find any kind of healing through anything you've been through, you have to have a relationship of safety. That's priority number one. And so that's what I do. And so the first things first is you, like me, I have to make it safe for you. Right. I have to remind you, like, I'm not here to judge you. Like, I don't give a shit. And this is why veterans are really good at often working with other veterans, because we all know what it's like. And the good ones with empathy are like, man, I know what it's like. There's no judgment. You talk about whatever you need to talk about, express it, say it, cry. I don't give a shit. Right. Yep. That's when you know you have a safe relationship. But the first thing that happens is people feel deeply. Right? Because all of that energy that happened from that event is still in there, right? It just consistently resurges to the surface. And then you feel like you're hyper anxious, you're angry, you're sad, you're depressed. All of those things are all things that are the energy that's resurfacing from the original event, or even before the original event, to a different event that traumatized you, that you haven't processed. And so the initial portions of expression is really just it's vomit, right? It's just a regurgitation of all of these feelings and these expressions that you've never been able to do. It's messy, it's dirty, right? It's not anything what you think it should be, right? You're thinking like, I don't know why I just said that, but the reality is like, I'm looking at it and I'm like, good. Right? Because I'm not trying to get you to say the right thing. I'm just trying to get you to say anything. Because once you start saying anything, you build a relationship of safety.
Well, so you bring up safety, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Your first set of needs are safety, right? Yeah. And Maslow looks at it like food, water, shelter. But in a relationship, when it comes to coaching, consulting, counseling, whatever, right? You do that level that you can let your walls down and you won't get stabbed, shot, assaulted, metaphorically speaking, right? Like where your ideas are going to get shot down, or you're going to be told you're wrong. That's one of the most toxic traits you can have with a significant other or a parent, or really anybody, I guess, is when you tell someone your feelings and they tell you you're wrong. Well, no. Yeah. Feelings aren't wrong. They're feelings.
Right.
Now, are the facts based around your feelings wrong? They might be. So you can do a little fact checking, but the feelings, absolutely need to be qualified. The other thing I was thinking about when you said was, you said it's uncomfortable at first, and certainly it is, right? Whenever we do something new for the first time, it's relatively uncomfortable, especially when we're unpacking. And what I've realized in my time and years of doing counseling and talking to veterans, it's almost, to me, it's like there's a half-life to it, right? It's not like you're the empathetic feelings guy. I'm the put on an Excel spreadsheet and how do we math this problem away, right? And this is where my head went, because it's interesting to me, right? So whenever what do you call it, microorganisms, things like that. Or even like uranium, like it all have half-lives, right? Which is okay. You're familiar with how half-life will work,
yeah,
right? Over a period of time, this is where it gets to half its potency, and then half, and then half, and then half, and then half, right? So here's my hillbilly math, right? It's like, let's say 100 is always a good number, right? So for example, it might take 5 years, right, to get it down to 50. 5 years of intense therapy to get it to 50. Well, now you're at 50, and in 5 more years, it's gonna be down to 25. And in 5 years from that, it's going to be 12.5. It's like, does it ever go away? No, it's there. But the amount of vomit, the amount of regurgitation, they talk about in when you go through trying times, you are very detailed about it, right? You know every detail about the situation because you're so committed. And then over time, you can really tell you're on a healing journey when you start to forget the details. And that's a healthy thing. Because it's like you felt it, you harbored it, but you said it, you let it all out. And now you're opening up more space, more inventory in your heart and your brain and your soul, wherever it is living. You're opening up more space for new idea generation, for new relationships, for new thoughts. It's a cluttered mind often is what it is. It's like, you take a cluttered mind, throw some trauma in there, bury it underneath more clutter. Well, you got to do something to start making heads or tails of anything.
So I've seen it both ways, where people start kind of giving up the details, where they don't need to think about them anymore. And you're right, it's clutter. Clutter's a really good word for it. But I've seen it multiple ways, right? People who have been through a lot of trauma, especially childhood trauma, they don't have the memories to begin with. There's the feelings are there, but the memories are not. And so the clutter is different, right? And everybody's different. Everybody's body and mind are all different. They operate on the same, hardware, software, but how they operate is always a little bit different. But from my experience, I've seen people who the details become more clear as they do more expression and they do more trauma work and healing. Whereas other people, once they start talking, they're like, I feel better. Right. And I think that really is that disconnection between the mind and the body, or the nervous system and the body, and how those memories were kind of cataloged in the body's memory system. Because memory is not a head thing. Right? Memories aren't stored in just the head. The memories are literally stored everywhere, right? The heart, the tissue of your muscles, right? And that's why you'll see, if you've ever been through an IED blast or know someone that's been through an IED blast, you'll often see people with tics, where one of the stories that I've heard is this gentleman went through an IED blast and he remembers looking over his left shoulder right before the blast because someone called something out, and from the moment he healed from obviously that blast, he always had a tic that went to the left, and people thought he had Tourette's, right? So the psychologist that he went to see diagnosed him with Tourette's and treated him as such. But then he realized, like, this isn't working for me. This doesn't make any sense for me because I have no other symptoms of Tourette's, just this tic. And another gentleman by the name of Peter Levine worked with him and diagnosed him with CPTSD, right? And so, like, there's a dramatically different diagnosis there.
What's CPTSD?
Complex PTSD. So complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And complex post-traumatic stress disorder is a much deeper and more intricate kind of disconnection than just your standard practice of PTSD. It's typically linked with childhood trauma. It's typically linked with consistent and prolonged trauma. It's not from a single event. Typically, it can be, but for the most part, CPTSDs, a lot of people are from consistent and prolonged trauma. So things like sexual abuse and sexual trauma are family trauma, domestic violence, domestic abuse, stuff like that. Typically is integrated into CPTSD.
I've never even heard of that, and I guess it's interesting. I mean, it makes sense, and that's the other challenge. The other side is when we come back. I heard this on gentleman was on Joe Rogan podcast, and he was talking about how, like, there's the amount of veterans that come back diagnosed with PTSD against the ones that already actually have PTSD. It's like the ones diagnosed is significantly higher than ones that actually have it. If you look at the amount of trauma and the given events, the challenge is a lot of the linear things, right? A lot of things that happen when we go through the transformation. Like you said, going to Afghanistan is hard. Coming back is hard, right? They're both I hate the word hard, but they're both complicated. And the challenge is a lot of the things you go through from a symptomatic point of view is transformation.
Yeah.
You're going to get angry. You're going to get frustrated. You're going to be short. You're going to get, I call it twitchy, right? Those things identified doesn't necessarily mean you have PTSD. It means that you're working through some stuff. And I would argue that the treatment is similar, which is you got to work through it. Mm-hmm. And if you don't work through it, you're going to keep carrying it with you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, both PTSD and CPTSD are both disorders that very much dramatically affect how the body regulates itself in terms of emotions. And I think there is a very dramatic spectrum, right? From I don't have any problems regulating myself to PTSD and then CPTSD on the far end of that other spectrum. And veterans go through every piece of the spectrum, right? If you have no trauma prior to basic training and you walk into basic training, you have just been in some ways traumatized because you've never seen this situation. You've never seen what this is. And it may be, right, to some people, it may be big, it may be small. And so you may be close to the one end of the spectrum. You're probably not to CPTSD spectrum. But if you go to Afghanistan, right, and you go to Korengal Valley and you take fire for 300 days in a row, the reality that you probably have an issue regulating your emotions is probably pretty high, and how the body reacts to that, right? You may have a guy that goes there and has CPTSD, is diagnosed with PTSD. But then that another guy in his squad goes there and comes back fine, right? Has no issues, lives his life, doesn't look like he has any problem regulating himself. And this is all body dependent, right? It's all how the body interacts with change and how it interacts with transition, and also interacts with the environment around you, right? So safety, danger, right? These incredibly important moments in your life in which you feel things, right? Because if the body feels things, it's going to change what it does. That's what our nervous system is very good at, is when we step into a situation, we react, right? That's what the amygdalae are for, to help us regulate the reaction to get what we want, right? If we want to escape, all of our bodily systems are going to shut down and push towards the extremities that can get us farther away from that situation. And so if the body doesn't get to process through exactly what the amygdalae kind of choose for us, then you're going to step into the shades of PTSD and CPTSD.
So there's the science behind why I feel twitchy.
Yeah.
Well, and that's, I mean, it's important for myself, hearing you talk about it, and even for our listeners to understand that, I think one of the things you said that I'll push back on is we all have the same hardware and software. I'll disagree with you on that. We have same hardware, right? We're Homo sapiens, we're human beings, but our software is very different with the way we are raised. The values that were brought to us by our parents. I think that's where it really gets different, and that's where it also affords us the opportunity of control and recognizing that yes, two people might experience the exact same stimulus, but they're but they didn't run in parallel. They even look they look at it with twins, for example, like twins that are separated at birth, right? They have the same hardware, the human skeleton, right? But they have software that's like preconditioned into a certain extent.
Sure.
Right. And then they end up, not like the ironic things like, oh, they both married a woman named Jan. No, they have weird twitches, or they hold the coffee cup a certain way, or they do something, they tie their shoes in an unusual manner. Right. Like, that's the part of the software that is different. Like,
yeah,
you have people in the military. It's like, yeah, when we're all standing there in basic training, we all get the same training. Right. We're all standing there left and right. But what you came in with day one, whether it was childhood trauma or just how you were born, will make you more adaptable than others. That's why there are, soldiers or not, or military members or not. There's different people in this world that can handle different trauma.
Yeah,
I know. I think when I talk to doctors and nurses, if I know I'm going into a situation, like if I watch like surgery shows or blood on TV, I get twitchy. Like I don't even like to watch it. I'm like, why would I go after that, right? Now, in real time, I have no problem with it or my own, but as soon as it's over, I don't want to see it. Well, you have like doctors and nurses that are like into that thing. Or I have a friend who's a mortician, and she went to a funeral, ironic for someone that was KIA in Iraq early in the war, and it was someone she went to high school with, and she was going to school to be like a marketing consultant or something, and then turned into, she's a funeral director. And it's like, well, I don't want to do that, right? Like, you have a predisposition. Same with the military. The difference is in the military, it's like you take all these different people from all this different software, you give them the exact same stimulus, and then on the back end, the military thinks they have, same solution, right? So you have someone who has a twitch in his neck, and it's like, oh, it must be Tourette's. You have somebody that's struggling when they get back home, it's like, oh, it must be PTSD. And it's like, well, that's not the case. And I would argue, right? This is one of the reasons behind this podcast. It's not the government's responsibility.
No, it's not.
It's your responsibility, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to sit here and play the game of whose fault is it. It is, well, who has to live with this person the rest of their life?
Yeah.
The person does.
The work that I do is entirely predicated on whether you come to me voluntarily or not. Right? Like I will not go out of my way to go bring someone to me. I've done that before. Like I started out on TikTok talking about all of this stuff, and I reached out to a couple of veterans that posted videos that were struggling, got no response, right?
Yeah.
And what I recognized from that is because people would tag me, because obviously I'm a creator that is trying to work in that space. So people would tag me and show me these veterans that are struggling. I would reach out and nothing would happen. And then I had someone actually come and work with me that went through that and never came back. Right. And maybe it's me, maybe it's not, but the thought that comes to mind initially is, if you're not in the right space, if you're not in the right kind of perspective and preparedness to step into the journey that I'm trying to help you get through, you're not going to get through it. Right. And I even look at my own journey as like, I was not ready until 25. I was at no point, if anybody came up to me that was like my level of mental health work, had come to me and said, "Hey, Dylan, you got a problem. Let's work on this." I would have said, "You're fucking crazy and get away from me." Right. Like I would not have worked on myself. And so everything I do, if you want to work with me, you got to pay, right? You got to pay for me because you have to show me that you're willing to actually step into something that you've got skin in the game for. Because I've handed out free sessions that have, like maybe it worked, maybe it didn't, but I don't know, right? The reality is if you want to change your life, you have to be the arbiter of it. You have to be judge, jury, and executioner of all your weaknesses and your shame and your guilt and all that stuff that is holding you back from stepping into this reality that you can talk to people about these hard and difficult things, and these people aren't going to look at you with shame and judgment. It's really 100% your responsibility to face the trauma that you have been through, even if it wasn't your fault. It is now given to you, and it is your responsibility to face it, and that's unfortunate. Right. I'll be the first to say that it's never an enjoyable experience to listen to someone have to talk about this stuff because I know it sucks, but it is still, it's your life. Right. And you said it before, and I say it all the time, right? You got to live with yourself for 100% of your life. Nobody else does. Right. Your mom's not going to be there. Your wife's not going to be there for 100% of your life. You are. And so if you want to live your life in a way that is, disconnected and disconcerting towards yourself and your body, then you're welcome to do that. It's not my call. But if you want to change, if you want to find joy, enjoy life, find happiness, build good relationships with people, you're going to have to look at yourself different and take responsibility for the fact that you have trauma that maybe someone else gave to you.
Well, what you and I are in the business of consulting, not convincing.
Yeah.
And there's a huge difference. I have been with soldiers, even as of recently, that refused to go to behavioral health. They refused to take advantage of the resources afforded to them. Right? There wasn't any of options. They refused to do it. And in one case recently, I had to get law enforcement involved because at that point I'm not in the business of convincing. I can consult. And the cops, well, they weren't in the business of convincing either. They were consulting, and their manner of consulting involved handcuffs and a ride and 72-hour hold because the goal was to keep that person alive. And we made mission in that particular situation that recently happened. And so my main discipline, the main business I'm in, is in junk removal. And when you were talking about this, and the reason I use the word clutter quite a bit is because I have a pretty cluttered mind, and a lot of people do, and it's in my vein, but as you're talking about this, it's no different than people that are hoarders. Where I see this firsthand, it's like they had this past trauma, and it's manifested into physical items. Whether it's the power to keep, or it's the satisfaction of purchasing, or it's the loss of I don't want to get rid of the stuff I have. Right? Those are three basic ideas behind how does the question. There's no such thing as rhetorical questions in this world. The question is, how did it get like this? Well, those are three. There might be more, but those are three very basic understandings. And I talk about this often because I'll get realtors, powers of attorney, lawyers, family members. They're like, how do you convince people to get rid of their stuff? And I'm like, I don't. I wait for them to die. I wait for Child Protective Services to show up. I wait for them to go to a home. That's it, right? I can't convince someone, right? And just like you, it's like you can't convince someone to get support, right? I love the word support over help. To get support if they don't want support. You said it was 25. Same thing. It was 2009. That's when I started going to the VA. Almost to the day I turned 25. I turned 25 in March. I started going at March or April, right in that time frame. And that was when I was like, okay, dummy, talking to myself, you don't have to do this alone. And then, like a good soldier, I thought I had issues because I was bored, and I was bored because I wasn't working. So we're going to solve for X. Let me get working. I won't be bored. If I'm not bored, I'm not going to have drinking problems. If I don't have drinking problems, I don't have suicidal ideations. If I don't have suicidal, right? So it's all for X. So I got working, and then I got busy, right? Which takes no skill to get busy, but I got busy for a number of years. And then it manifested again. And 2 years ago, I submitted again, right? You hear about this with AA. They submit to a higher power. Again, not a religious guy. Don't knock if you are, right? If that's your thing. But ultimately, I had to step outside of myself, like you were talking about earlier, step out. I had to look at myself from a third-person perspective and say, okay, how would I treat someone that what advice would I give to someone that was in my shoes? Well, I'd say, hey, you need to go talk to somebody that's not a friend or a family member. And I started seeing my counselor again about 2 years ago. Recently in my book, I thanked her in my book because I wouldn't be here today standing tall the way I am without her. Now, she is the catalyst, but I chose, right? I'll take the victory that I earned. I put the work in, right? She's a catalyst. She's empathetic. She takes it all in. But I chose to show up. And that's important too. When you start making these choices that are healthy, you got to give yourself a pat on the back. You got to give yourself the grace to fail, and you got to celebrate those victories. Because for a while, I'm like, oh, I'm going to counseling. I'm kind of kicking myself, and da-da-da. And then finally, I'm like, no, I'm going to counseling. You know what? Me going to counseling 11 a.m. every other Monday is like other people going to the gym. I'm putting the work in. I'm using muscles that I'm being intentional about, and I'm exercising them, and I'm challenging myself, and that's important to me. And it didn't happen because the drinking. It didn't happen because the sleepless nights. It didn't happen because everyone told me I needed to. It happened because I chose different.
Yep.
And I'll put this out there to family members. I have a few family members that have substance abuse problems, and it's no different than veterans. I actually have a former employee where his wife recently left him. It's like, well, he hasn't chose differently. And after whatever it's been, 15, 20 years, I mean, their oldest, I think, is a senior in high school. So however long it's been, he continues to choose the same choices. Well, you're going to get the same results. And eventually people are going to walk away. The person in need of healing needs to heal.
Yeah.
And it's not always the veteran. Sometimes it's the family member. Al-Anon. Al-Anon is out there for people that have people in their life that have substance abuse problems. My mom went to Al-Anon for years because of the people in our family that she struggled with. And she had to learn how to understand what is and what is not controllable and what is healthy for her. Right? So it's like, okay, it wasn't her cross to bear, right? Little religious analogy, but she had a different cross. And it ultimately was on her. Yeah. And if she doesn't set expectations with people, if she doesn't hold herself and others accountable to her boundaries, well, then it's on her.
Right.
And it's no different than me. The challenge I have, it sounds so simple, but I do counseling on Monday because it's a really good way to kick off my week. And a lot of times what I struggle with is on the weekends. I struggle, when I don't have my daughter and when I don't have work. I know my triggers, right? So Mondays are always good. The challenge I have is there's a lot of holidays, federal holidays on Mondays, and my counselor works at the VA. I never even thought about that. Right? So you got Columbus Day, you got President's Day,
yep.
Right? These Monday, whatever. MLK, I think, is on a Monday. Yep. So it's like once a month, it's like it would be too simple for me to like, oh yeah, we'll just skip 2 weeks of the holiday, we'll just skip. Well, it's like, hold on, that's a whole month, right? Am I going to be my best self if I go a whole month without counseling? No, I'm not. So even this last week, I think it's President's Day that's coming up here in February, I was going to miss. And I'm like, oh, we'll just do it on the Wednesday thereafter, right? And adjusting my schedule because I got to say, hey, that's a priority. And the one, I was looking at my calendar, I was going to go do yoga. And instead I'm like, nope, I'm going to go to counseling, right? It's like, I like yoga. It's good for me. It's my mental health, but it's not the same as counseling because I choose it. I make it a priority. And when I make it a priority, I live the life I want to live because I got to live with me.
Right.
And then I can show up the best for my daughter. I can show up the best for my employees. I can show up the best for my family. It's when I make those choices. And when I do this with you, it's like, even from, 40 minutes ago, 50 minutes ago, when we started this conversation, like, even listening to you, it's calming and it forces me to slow down my cadence and listen intentionally and hear what you're saying. And it's therapeutic. There's value in it. and it's value to our listeners to hear two guys figuring it out.
Yep.
You know, this isn't like, hey, here's my PowerPoint presentation of my 30 years of research. I actually was watching a piece on Matt Walsh the other day, and they're like, hey, do you have a medical degree? He's like, no. He's like, well, then what is your perspective? He's like, a father, a man, someone's been on the planet for 35 years. They're like, well, what qualifications do you have? He goes, I can read. And it's like, okay, all right. Like that is his perspective. And same with you and I. It's like, that's our perspective. It's 35 years combined service in the military. It's talking to the people. It's the shit we went through. It's the fact that we can read other people's perspective. It's the fact that most of the content I watch on YouTube, it is Emily King talking about relationships. It's Jordan Peterson talking about everything Jordan Peterson talks about, right? But how to be a warrior, right? A lot of what his latest stuff is, right, is about being a monster or being a warrior, right? It's a lot of that stuff. And when you watch that over and over, you start to think about it and you start to evaluate yourself. You know, it's not mindless TV like watching The Simpsons or King of the Hill, the things I would have watched in my youth. It's now, if I'm going to take the time to be entertained to a certain check out, I want to do it with some level of intentionality. And when you do that, it sparks other ideas and you become optimistic. Mm-hmm. And that's the goal, is that when veterans and their family members come home, it's like, it's not a switch. It's not a time frame. It's not you got to put the work in every day. You got to be intentional in the chaos. And you have to understand that you're going to fail. You're gonna struggle. It is muddy. It is complicated. And once you recognize that, well, that reduces anxiety. You're like, okay, not so bad. Other people are feeling the same way. And that's why this is important.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to go back to something you said a little bit earlier. You said talking. When I say the word expression, I don't always just mean talking, right? Like, obviously when I work with people, a lot of what we do is talking, but expression is a different animal, right? It's not just talking. To some people, like yourself, it might be talking. Your expression is taking a feeling that you have and putting it into words. That's your version of expression.
Yep.
There are musicians out there that they take a feeling and they express it through music. There are artists that take a feeling and they express it through paint and drawing and coloring and using different instruments to make something, right? Sculptures. There are many different forms of expression, and it's almost infinite, right? Poetry, it could be writing, it could be music, it could be art, it could be absolutely anything, it could be video games, right? What is necessary is for each person to find their own form of expression that allows them to take the feeling that they have in their body and to develop an understanding of how to allow it to leave, right? To allow it to get to express itself, right? Because that's what the body is trying to do when it's in danger, is it's trying to express that energy into something useful, which is escaping, fighting, feigning, subordinating, right? Like any of those four that we understand the amygdala allows us to do. And so we need to, in many ways, reconnect with what that energy is trying to do and allow it to be expressed in whatever way we can. And so if you go to therapy and you're like, I don't know if this is working, the first thing you need to evaluate is, what do you value in terms of expression, right? Because it may not be talking. But the one thing I would say is, before you end your relationship with your therapist, is determine if that is a good relationship at all for you, right? There shouldn't be judgment. There shouldn't be shame from your therapist. There shouldn't be things that make you feel like you are not worthy of talking to that person. And then
and it's gotta be the right energy.
Yeah, it does.
When I got back from Gitmo, the counselor I had from Iraq, she wasn't available, and I started seeing a counselor. I probably saw her for 6 months, and it was like seeing her weekly, and I felt no better when I left than when I showed up.
Yeah,
it was like I need someone that, again, my counselor now, Jody, who then I got back, and when I came back the second time, I said, hey, I remember I wait like 2-3 months, I think, for my first appointment, then get on a regular schedule. It was like with her, it was the right energy. I lucked out, I guess. The very first counselor I had when I was really in a bad spot ended up being the best counselor I've ever had. And I went to Vets Place Center. I went to a couple of counselors there, and I went to couples counseling when I was with an ex-fiance of mine. Like, so I've been a lot of counselors, but I had one in particular, individual counseling through the VA, and she was a student, and it was like, I could say whatever I wanted, and she kind of just nodded, and it's like, well, that's some bullshit. Like, I need someone that's going to challenge me. I need someone that's going to stop me in my tracks. I remember even the physical distance. I remember this was pre-COVID, but it was like, it was a larger room she was in. It was like a old like group room that turned into her office, whatever. But it's like we were physically, 15, 20 feet apart. I remember sitting there, and I'm like, I felt like I was alone, even in the room. When I sit down with Jody now, she's a small office. She sits there. She turns away from her computer. It's bright in there. The sun's there. I can kind of get distracted by what's going on outside. I'm like, okay, this is my jam. And when we talk, it's like she's listening, she's nodding, and she'll stop me when I'm getting a little tangenty. She'll be like, oh, hold on, let's focus here.
Yeah.
Right, and she'll bring up books, and she'll bring up articles because she knows that I'll digest that. She gave me a book the other day about PTSD, and she'll make printouts for me because I don't know. You know what? It's in my backpack. Hold on, I'll grab it right now. Hold on a second. Let me see if I can find it.
Sure.
Did you feel the dead air while I was gone?
Not at all. I sat awkwardly.
Dead air, kind of. Got to have dead air. So, no, the book is called Tears of Valor, a family story of combat and living with PTSD. So she's had it. I've been looking at this book because it's been on her shelf, and she had like 3 copies of it. I've been looking at it for like 2 years. Finally, this last week, I had finished a book I had read, and I was like, I really want that. I've been seeing it, and a lot of books I've read dancing around the topic, and this is like down and dirty. Like, that's it. Like,
yeah.
PTSD, combat. Like, that's it. The other book, actually, while I was over there, I finished this book the other day. This was heavy, man. This took me a month to read because there's some days I can only get through a few pages because it was heavy or I wasn't in the right mind, whatever.
Yeah.
The book called The Mountain Is You, Transforming Self-Sabotage into Self-Mastery.
I've heard of it.
Weist. Actually, it was recommended by my ex-girlfriend, and man, it was heavy.
Yeah.
It was heavy, and it was good, and there was a handful of chapters that, I read that, 3 or 4 page sections where I read it a dozen times. It's like I read it to really understand what the author was conveying and make sense of. Does it make sense to me, or does it apply to me? And it was a tough book too, because a lot of the books I read are either more entertaining. Everything I read is nonfiction, but it was either, other books are either business where it's like, oh, go do this and make that change, or shift your mindset and this will be good. This book here was heavy because it was like, well, now I understand more, but it's almost like you feel like now that you understand more, you realize how much you don't understand.
Right.
And so this was, even just flipping this chapter now, and man, did this suck. It sucked as in it sucked the life out of me because it was heavy. I've never had a book slow me. I've had books where I've fallen asleep. I've had books where they were boring. It was heavy.
Yeah.
That's it. And of course, it's talking about self-sabotage. It's like I'm waiting for the chapter that talks about everybody else, and 250 pages later, I'm still working on me.
Right.
That's a lot of. It was heavy, and there's no pictures. I like books with pictures. Like, there's a book called Steal Like an Artist. The guy's written 3 books, and 200 pages. So it's a physically smaller book, larger print, lots of pictures. Man, like 90 minutes to 2 hours. Crank them out, and you feel great. You're like, man, I read a book today. Right? Seriously, I read the entire book one day. I'm like, man, I read a book today. And now this one, it's like, I read a book this month.
That's, that's the...
And for me to not jump, here's the thing. I don't have a lot of rules in this world, right? I'm not self-discipline, like whatever. I don't wake up disciplined. There's a couple rules, and one of those rules is you finish what you start. You put it on your plate, you eat it. You start going to college, you finish with a degree. It is no different than movies, right? Or even a song on the radio. Like I don't stop until the song's over. If I'm watching a movie, I'm watching all the way through, or I'll pick up the next day. Yeah. Same with this book. There were several times that I picked up a few other books along the way that I wanted to get to the next book, and I know what's going to happen. If I get to the next book, I'm not going to finish that book. And as soon as I convince myself that not finishing one book is okay, it's out the window. Then not finishing any book is okay, right? It's like how you do the simple things defines how you do everything.
Right. Yeah.
So, anyways, Tears of a Warrior. That was the original thing. I like the big fonts. This one's bigger font. So, and lots of pictures for those of you guys watching at home. It's got pictures. Again, I'm not saying like full like fill in the blank, but you got a chapter here with a chart or a big picture. Them 170 pages, they fly by. You feel good. 248 pages, no pictures.
Yeah.
Ask me about it in a month.
It's a little bit different. I've heard of the book. I've never read it myself, but I know a little bit about the author and the reality of a more self-focused healing journey, which is kind of like rather than going to a therapist or having someone else kind of tell you about yourself, the reality of kind of doing it yourself, which is a lot of like what I've done and a lot of what that book is about, from what I understand. It's a journey that opens you up to more questions than answers. And nail on the head. Yeah. I don't feel like I have any more answers. I feel like I got more things I got to look at. Right. And that's the purpose, right? Like when you step into a healing journey, you should be asking yourself more questions. The problem, I think, where people get hung up is they think they have the answer. And that's never the case, right? When you're healing, I can tell you from experience, right? Like my clients that I've had for 2 or 3 years now, it's not a linear thing. It's like we start at the beginning and we talk about their life up until now. Mm-hmm. No, that's not how it works. We talk about the beginning of their life and then we get to the end, and then all of a sudden there's this recollection or this understanding that has come from that whole story being expressed, that we have to go back to the beginning and rethink this and look at the perspective differently of how you were 20 years ago versus how you are now. And that consistently happens because basically what you're doing, I like to look at the process of healing a lot like editing a book, right? Because I've done that. You write the first draft and you're like, this sucks, right? Because it's like you're telling your story for the first time. Like, here's my story. It sucks, right? I hate it. I hate my story, right? And the reality is like, well, you're not gonna sell that book. You're not gonna give that to people and be like, this is my story, because you're like, I hate it, right? So you have to rewrite it, and you're like, you know what? I'm gonna take out chapter 1, 2, and 6, and 13, and I'm gonna rewrite all of those. I like these ones though, right? And then you re-edit it. You retell the story, and you're like, I still don't like it, right? So now you're like, I don't like chapter 3, 4, 8, and 9 now. And so you like, that's the process is as you go along and you tell your story and you express your story and you feel these things, what you realize is that you have more questions about what you've expressed and why you express it, right? You might be like, I used to think I was all that in a bag of chips when I was 12 years old because I won a championship in basketball. And you realize like, maybe I wasn't, right? Like, why did I feel that way?
You were,
right?
But so what? Yeah.
Right. And then you get to this point of like what you're talking about yourself of like, I never thought I was good enough. And you ask yourself why, right? And you think like, well, maybe it was the military, right? And then you're like, wait a second, right? You talk about your military career and you're like, it was there before that. Right. And then you're slowly revealing back all the way to the beginning of these moments where you realize that wasn't the beginning of all of this. And you start to understand where the idea is fostered, where this stuff comes from, right? Because, I talk about trauma a lot, but there's something more kind of intimate than trauma, that what you're talking about, and this idea of, I don't feel like I'm good enough. Well, what is that? What do you call that? Right? In some ways, I think that's emotional trauma, right? It's this small idea. It's like the inception of, you get this idea in your head. Maybe it's 5 years old when your dad tells you you're not good enough at this to do it, right? And you take that idea and you build it, right? You build this castle of, I'm not good enough, right? Well, what do you call that, right? We don't have a word in the English language that defines what that is. And so the best thing I can say right now is emotional trauma, because it's not what we want it to be. And it gives us extreme discomfort when we think about it. And so, like, that's the real tangible work that needs to be done, especially for veterans, because we're looking at this idea of all of these things that happen in the military, but all of these things that happened before that taught us to be who we are. And why did we choose the military, right? And then why did we choose to do the things that we did in the military? And how did that affect it? How did that whole concoction of what happened throughout our lives turn out, right? And how do we perceive ourselves now? That's the tangible things that we need to really look at as human beings, if we want to progress into a self that is regulated and connected with body and mind. And that's really like the work that you're talking about, that you're doing, is incredible, because that's the stuff that is the hardest to really work through, because it's the most deep and the most complicated.
And that's where I struggle. It's like, I'm a studier of this stuff, and I look at this stuff and I think about this stuff, and often I hear or read stuff and I'm like, oh, this makes sense, drawing parallels. It's like I read this and I'm like, oh, it's like I didn't have any more answers, and you're right. It's like it's that next evolution of thinking. Yep. And so part of this book, I talked to, in the last couple of weeks, I really wrapped my head around this idea that I was not good enough. And we, we're recording this episode here in mid-February. Really, it was, I went through a breakup about 3 months ago, a little over 3 months ago. And I habitually was saying that, right, as I was talking to her and retelling the story to whoever would listen. And I talked about it with her after the holidays when we had some time to reconvene. And then I read this book, and I think of other aspects of my life, and it's like, yeah, that's right. I look at it as, like you said, there's not a word, like, the expression, like, well, there's a chip on your shoulder. And it's like, that chip on my shoulder, that idea that I'm not good enough. It's like, yeah, you know what? You're right. It's there, because when I'm doing things I want to do, right? When people say, "Hey, Andy, why are you doing this or why are you doing that?" It's like, well, because someone told me I couldn't, right? Like that's a hell of a fuel, right? And I love it. I mean, that is my fuel, right? I talk about it in my TEDx, right? Transform your pain into passion to define your purpose, and really that is my fuel. Not even was it is my fuel. It is my fuel that. Okay, well, let's believe this for a second. Okay, Andy, you're not good enough. All right. Well, what do you got to do to be good enough? Oh, I got to do this. Okay, well, what's stopping you?
Right.
Okay. Well, guess what? This is a conversation I'm having with myself.
Right.
Right? There's nobody else here. I look to my left and my right, and it's me that has to have this conversation. Right. It's me that has to answer this conversation, and it's me that's going to, think different, to do different, to be different.
Even if someone tells you you're not good enough, at some point you take that voice and you make it your own. And
that's what I'm saying. Yep. It's like I am owning that I'm not good enough.
Yep. And
I'm good with that.
The reality of life is that I always love to entertain this. The reality is that it's true. You're not good enough.
Right.
And when you really embrace that and understand that, when you look at the world and the people that you maintain within that, you recognize that you don't have to be good enough, and you choose who you want to be good enough for, right? There are people that have, just like you've said before, there are people that have standards that are not, you're not able to,
good
stand up to, right? And there are people that have low standards. There are people that have high standards. And when you recognize you're not good enough, and you really, I think, do it from a healthy standpoint, you recognize that you don't have to try to be good enough for people that expect you to be perfect. You don't have to.
No.
The only thing you have to do is be able to live with yourself and accept and understand that what is good enough for you is the question you really need to ask yourself, and that's about it.
Yeah, it was interesting. The girl that I idolized in high school. Man, I thought the world of her, and I finally dated her towards the end of my senior year and into that summer. And then we broke up, and then I had a lot of reasons, but and then I decided like 15 years later, I think 2017, right? I graduated high school in 2002, so yeah, 2017, 15 years later, I reached out to her. I wasn't feeling good about myself, and it was weird. I wasn't feeling good about myself, but I also felt like I needed to reach out to her. So I struggled with that idea, and I reached out to her, and then we dated again, and then went south, and then like a year later we kind of started talking again, and then it went south, and I didn't talk to her for 4 years. And then she reached out to me around the holidays, and it was almost like her vindication. It's like 20 years of me idolizing this person, 20 years of me chasing this person. I finally broke it off, and after 4 years she reached out to me, and the last text message I said to her was to the effect of, you know what, I never thought I was good enough for you. And I've come to the realization I was always good enough. Not for her, but I was good enough for me. And it was like, in some weird fucked up way, it's like I put this person on a pedestal, and this, right? Jordan Peterson talks about this at length, about how when you get shot down by a woman, it's like the manifesting that you got shot down by all women, right? And talks about that. And it's almost like that was the one person that had that it manifested. And even earlier when I was talking about who I wasn't good enough for, I didn't bring her up because it wasn't top of mind, but now it is top of mind with her. And it's like I conquered the dragon.
Yeah.
And not her, but there's the idea that, you know what, it's not going to work out. The relationship didn't work out 3 times over 2 decades for different reasons. And it's not her fault. It's not my fault. Yeah. It is what it is. Destiny wasn't meant to be whatever it is, but this idea that, okay, no, Andy, you were good enough, and you've always been good enough, and moreover, you'll always be good enough.
Yeah.
So long as you put the effort into the places you're supposed to be, because when you're not right, when I have this feeling of I'm not good enough, and there's nothing I can do about it, those 2 statements can be absolutely true. Okay, you're not good enough, and there's nothing you can do about it. So what are you going to do? Well, walk away seems like a pretty good idea. Yeah. Right, and put my efforts towards something else. Normally at the end of the program here, we talk about top takeaways, and I already did. That's my top takeaway. My top takeaway here in this healing journey, this life journey, is, you know what, not being good enough. It can be true in certain times, and that's for me to decide. It's for me to evaluate against my own parameters, right, against the rules that I make, and when it's not good enough, I'm still in control. Mm-hmm. Top takeaway, Dylan.
I think I'm always going to go back to this is, when we have this kind of discussion, is you're the person that has to live with yourself for 100% of your life. It's in my book. It's something I say consistently, and I think it's something that when you really think about it, it's the most powerful thing that you can give, powerful gift that you can give yourself, is when you really understand that and allow yourself to be comfortable with you, right? Because you are the only person that will be there the entirety of your life. And if you can't be happy with you, then you're not going to be happy with anybody else. It's just, you'll always use them as a form of kind of coping. And that might be good for a time, but at some point it will end, and it usually won't end well. So the more you can come to respect yourself, love yourself, empathize with yourself, work through the weaknesses and the strengths, the better off you're going to be throughout the entirety of your life.
Yeah, that's I've never heard that before you said it, and it's so true. Ultimately, it's on you. So I'm going to challenge you. Right, we in this podcast and in life, we'll welcome you home. There's a place here. You can always contact us. You can find us on LinkedIn, Facebook. Find Dylan on TikTok and Instagram. We're here for you, but you got to be your biggest advocate. In the military, we're often told, and talk about selfless service. When you come back home, you got to put yourself first. You got to put yourself first, and you got to make yourself and the relationship you have with yourself your number one priority, so that you can be your best self when you show up for everybody else. On behalf of Dylan, I'm Andy. Welcome home.